Watchmen, the greatest graphic novel of all time. That's a very unfair and honestly kind of pretentious moniker to give to a comic book, but regardless of whether or not you personally think it's the best, there's really no denying that it surely is one of the best. Since the release of Watchmen in the 80s, many have tried to follow in its footsteps and present a darker, more mature take on the subject of superheroes. Unfortunately, many people fall short because the writers and artists mistake maturity for blood and boobs. Even official continuations of the Watchmen story have fallen short. DC first tried to make an official follow-up to Watchmen in 2012 with Before Watchmen, a prequel series. That series had some of the best writers and artists of the time come together and tell new stories about what happened to these characters before the events of the book. But the reception to Before Watchmen was very mixed. The quality of the books ranged from flat out terrible, just okay, and actually pretty good. And of those titles, really only the Darwin Cook written books are considered actually pretty good. There's also, of course, Doomsday Clock, DC's current sequel series to Watchmen, which is trying to integrate the Watchmen characters with the Justice League. This sounded like a great idea on paper and it started out really strong, but honestly, it feels like it's been meandering for the last few issues, and the delays in shipping have done nothing to help its momentum. I mean, really, it's been delayed so much, do you even care anymore? I don't care anymore, and there's only one issue left. But now, not only are we getting a brand new follow-up to Watchmen, but we're getting it in the form of a fancy-ass HBO television show. But there is no way that this could work, right? I mean, there's no way that the guy who screwed up the ending to Lost is going to be able to present to us a brand new television series about one of the best graphic novels around. Surely, there's no way it can match the sophisticated storytelling of the original comic. Well, actually, it does. One episode in, and I'm already convinced that the Watchmen TV show is the most successful follow-up to the original Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons masterpiece. It's the closest anyone has ever come to matching the original comic book in terms of style, tone, and storytelling complexity. Let's talk about it. Hopefully, I don't spoil it for you. Watchmen, the 2019 HBO television series that debuted this past Sunday, is of course not the first time anybody has tried to adapt this story into a live-action format. Most famously, there was a 2009 movie released by Warner Brothers and directed by Zack Snyder. It was very divisive amongst fans, to say the least. A Zack Snyder adaptation is divisive? You don't say. Now, believe it or not, I actually don't hate Zack Snyder's adaptation of Watchmen. I actually kind of like it. I think it gets a lot right, and you can obviously tell that a lot of passion and love for the source material went into the making of this movie. But it is still a very flawed movie. My biggest complaint about Zack Snyder's Watchmen is that it's mostly just surface level faithful. It gets the look of Watchmen down perfectly, but it isn't able to capture all the deeper text of the original comic book. Part of the problem is actually in the format. There's only so much you can do in a 2 to 3 hour movie with regards to storytelling. There's only so much information you can convey within that time frame. Even the director's cut of Watchmen, which is 3 hours long, isn't long enough to get into all the nitty-gritty of the original Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons book. At the time of the film's release, and even since then, many people have felt that Watchmen would have been better suited if it were adapted into a television miniseries. Tell the story over the course of, say, 12 hours, 12 episodes, 12 hours. This way it can have more time to grow and develop the characters and the world that they're trying to set up. And wouldn't you know it, now we're getting that television series. 10 years after Warner Brothers tried to make Watchmen a big-ass Hollywood movie, we're now getting a fancy-ass HBO television series based on the comic. From Damon Lindelof, of all people, the creator of Lost, and The Leftovers. Now, this is a format that makes more sense for Watchmen. I really think telling the story of Watchmen over the course of a season or two is the great next logical step. This way, you can flesh out the worlds and the characters a lot better and really get into all the details of what was trying to be conveyed in the original book. Also too, it has been said that we're living in the golden age of television. Hell, we're living in the golden age of superheroes on TV. So Watchmen would fit right into this time period in terms of telling its story over the course of a television season or two. Only Watchmen, the TV show, isn't exactly going to be the Watchmen as we know it. It's not going to be the original comic book at all, actually. Almost as soon as it was announced that the show was going to be made, Damon Lindelof took to Instagram to write a very lengthy post talking about how the show was actually going to be a remix of Watchmen. We later learned that what he actually meant was it was going to be a sequel to Watchmen. It was going to tell the story about what happened in that world 30 years after the events of the book. So on the one hand, this isn't actually that bad of an idea. The original Watchmen comic has proven to be very difficult to adapt into another format other than its original comic book form. It took close to 30 years to get a movie made out of it, and the movie that we did get didn't really land the way people thought it would. Keeping the show fairly removed from the events of the original comic and only calling upon it and referencing it when absolutely necessary might actually work. The only problem is there's all those examples of this exact thing not working in the past. Watchmen the comic has a pretty definitive ending. Ozymandias successfully ends the Cold War by causing a lot of death and destruction. The heroes either go into hiding or die, and the world moves on from there. Trying to follow up or add to Watchmen would ultimately undo everything the original comic was about. That's part of the reason why books like Before Watchmen and Doomsday Clock aren't really resonating with a lot of readers. To them, it just feels like a novelty. And worse still, if you try to continue Watchmen, then you turn it from a special book into just another ongoing superhero story. Now, this HBO show has already been confirmed to have nothing to do with Before Watchmen or Doomsday Clock. It's going to be its own thing that follows upon the events of the original comic book. Now, that in and of itself is a bold move, but again, we've seen in the past that trying to follow up Watchmen doesn't exactly work. And this is also technically an adaptation of Watchmen, which we've also seen doesn't really work all that well. And yet here we have a show that's trying to do both. It's trying to adapt a difficult to adapt comic book, and it's trying to follow up a difficult comic book to follow up. How in the hell is this gonna work? There's no way it could possibly work, can it? Well, based on the season premiere this past Sunday, I can honestly say that it does work. It works shockingly well, in fact. HBO's Watchmen is a faithful adaptation while still totally being its own thing. It maintains the look and feel of the original comic while at the same time forging its own path. Whereas the comic was all about the threat of nuclear war, which was a big thing in the 80s, the show is primarily focused on race relations and the power of the police, which is a big talking point in 2019. Using a more modern setting and issue makes the show feel more relevant than just trying to rehash what the original did. And its portrayal of the characters in this setting feels nuanced and layered rather than broad caricatures. One thing that really stuck out to me while watching the show was how it handled violence. Now, the original Watchmen comic is a very violent book. There's just no getting around that. Some of the characters bleed like water faucets in it. But the violence of Watchmen was never really the focus of Watchmen. Whenever it gets violent, like there's a fight or something violent happens on the page, there's a reason for it. Whenever blood appears in the comic, whenever someone starts bleeding, it's used for maximum shock value. Most Watchmen follow-ups and knockoffs, and even the movie, don't really understand this concept. They throw in graphic violence and blood because they think that's what it calls for. They feel like adding it in places where it doesn't need to be added. The Watchmen TV show is the first example I've ever seen of somebody successfully capturing how violence is handled in the Watchmen book. Blood and violence is used to shock and horrify, not because it looks cool. And yes, this includes the scene with the cows. You'll know it when you see it, trust me. Despite the differences of setting and themes, the Watchmen TV show still manages to be a faithful adaptation of the comic book because it invokes the feel of the comic. And it does this not necessarily by filling the frame up with references, although it does do that, but it does so by effectively translating the comic into a television format. Remember, Watchmen the comic is in essence a story about comics, and it uses this format to tell its story in a way that only comics can tell. Certain things that worked in the original, like panel transitions, the way it plays with time, and all of the Tales of the Black Freighter segments only work in the comic because Alan Moore wrote it to only work as a comic. That's why some of those same moments from the movie felt awkward and out of place. They didn't translate very well to the screen. By contrast, Watchmen the TV show successfully turns Watchmen into a TV show. The way it cuts between scenes is done in a way that's similar to other television shows. The way the camera moves with the action rather than being a still frame on a page. It plays with sound in interesting ways. The way it integrates the classic ticking clock of Watchmen into the show is actually pretty brilliant. And hell, instead of a pirate comic to cut back to, we get a television show to cut back to, a superhero television show, American Hero Story. It wasn't shown in episode 1, we only saw ads for it, but you can obviously tell that American Hero Story is going to fulfill the role that Tales of the Black Freighter did in the comic, only this time using a TV show in the format of a TV show. And how about that soundtrack? I mean, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, if you guys don't win all the Emmys and most of the Grammys, then you just know life is unfair. Now, I know it might be too early to judge an entire television series based on one episode of a 9-episode season. For all we know, the show could become a disaster very quickly. It just had a very good pilot. But you know how sometimes you sit down to watch something on TV and it just feels like you're watching something special? Watchmen is a show like that. It just doesn't feel like anything else that's on TV at the moment. Much like the comic that inspired it, HBO's Watchmen sets itself apart from other superhero shows on TV by just being layered with context and metaphor. It uses its medium to tell a story that's both political and personal. It's not necessarily about the battle between good guys and bad guys, but how the life of a masked vigilante affects that person and the people around them, the world around them. And sure, there are some shows like Daredevil and Jessica Jones that did a really good job of showing a darker, more mature take on the superhero story, but nobody does it like the way Watchmen does it. It always was a very special book, and I can tell, at least from one episode, that Watchmen is going to be a very special TV show. I'm very excited to see where this story goes throughout the course of the season, and hell, if the story is good enough, I'd love to see it continue into a second or third season, maybe divorce itself completely from the comic and go in all new wild directions. Regardless, this is definitely a show you're gonna want to check out. Did you watch the Watchmen TV show? What did you think of it? Are you excited to see more, or did you think it was just overhyped and you didn't get it? Let me know down below or anywhere on the internet. See, now that's how you do a dark and mature DC Comics adaptation that's grounded and about something. If for some reason you haven't already read the original Watchmen comic, I put an Amazon link in the description for you to buy it and check it out for yourself. It really is recommended reading for comic book fans. It's like Comics 101 right here. I also put an Amazon link to the movie because maybe you don't want to read. Maybe you just want to sit down and watch something. That's okay too. I also put an Amazon link to the Darwin Cook Before Watchmen stories, Minutemen and Silk Spectre, because those are seriously pretty good. You should check them out. If you've read this front to back, give those a try. You might find it interesting. And of course, don't forget that we have new videos every Tuesday and Wednesday, with Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern being Wulff Den Live. So subscribe to see all of that, like this video, and share it with a friend who maybe heard about Watchmen but doesn't understand what the big deal is. I feel like sometimes with that particular story, people just need a little push in the right direction to get into it. Hopefully, I can be that push. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.